Have you ever wondered about the shadowy figures who shaped the infamous Gambino Mafia family? While John Gotti's name is well known, the man who mentored him, Neil Dellacroce, has an equally riveting story filled with power, respect, and ruthless ambition. Dive into the life of Neil Dellacroce, a real gangster who rose from the streets of Little Italy to become the second most powerful man in the Gambino family. If you're eager to uncover more about this mobster's infamous exploits and the legendary social club that served as his headquarters for years, stick around till the end and hit subscribe button for more captivating mafia stories. Neil Dellacroce was born in 1914 in New York City to Italian immigrants from Sicily. He didn't look like the average Italian. Aniello had very light blue eyes. The family lived in the Little Italy neighborhood at 232 Mulberry Street, right across from the famous Alto Nights Club, frequented by mobsters like Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. As a child, little Aniello looked out the window at these rich men and did not yet know that in the future, this club would belong to him. There were few career prospects in overcrowded and impoverished Little Italy. Young Dellacroce got a job as a butcher's assistant after school, but at the age of 16, he received his first sentence for burglary. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in a penal colony. From there, he took the name Neil and began to build his reputation on the streets. In 1937, he was arrested again, pleaded guilty to assault, and was sentenced to 6 months in prison. By the late 1930s, he had attracted the attention of the Mangano family, whose boss was Vincent Mangano. Dellacroce received an offer to join the family. He is also credited with being a member of the Murder Incorporated gang, whose services were often used by Mangano's underboss, Anastasia. There is no exact data on this, but even if he was not a member of this gang, he was still famous as a brutal killer. It was said that he liked to look into the eyes of the victim before death to enjoy the moment of fading life. New York detective Ralph Salerno said, "Of all the criminals I saw personally, only 2 scared me, Carmine Galante and Neil Dellacroce. They had a creepy look, the real eyes of murderers." In 1951, Vincent Mangano, the head of the family, disappeared without a trace. It is likely that Anastasia ordered his elimination to take his place. The Mangano family became the Anastasia family, and Neil Dellacroce became a captain. A little later, Dellacroce befriended another captain named Armand Rava and joined his faction. In the early 1950s, another fateful encounter occurred. Dellacroce, an experienced criminal, met the young and daring John Gotti, who was an airport burglar and on the team of Carmine Fatico, another captain of the Anastasia family. In the 1950s, Dellacroce married a woman named Mary Riccardi. A year later, he had a son named Armand Dellacroce, named after Armand Rava. Armand would later follow in his father's footsteps and become a mobster. The Gambino family also included other blood relatives of Neil, his older brother Carmine, as well as nephews Angelo and Salvatore Ruggiero. But the most notable event in those years was the opening of the social club where Dellacroce would spend his entire career. In 1956, he bought the premises opposite his parents' house and opened the Ravenite Social Club, which became his headquarters for many years. He borrowed the club's name from his favorite Edgar Allan Poe poem. Men who came to the club always had to be dressed in suits, and drinking was forbidden inside. In August of that year, Dellacroce and 2 of his men were arrested during a raid on the club on vagrancy charges, despite having much more than the legal $2 in his pocket. After the search, several more counts were added to the list of charges: criminal conspiracy with local troublemakers and possession of an illegal weapon, a 12-inch blackjack. Dellacroce was soon released on $500 bail. This arrest was related to the investigation of journalist Victor Riesel, who, in April 1956, had acid splashed in his face, which led to blindness. Riesel had been actively protesting against union corruption. The perpetrator of the attack was shot and killed by police on Mulberry Street, just a block from the Ravenite. Officers were ordered to take all suspicious individuals into custody. However, it wasn't just Dellacroce's own life that was troubled, but the Mafia as a whole. On October 25, 1957, there was a major change in the family structure. Albert Anastasia was shot and killed while visiting a barbershop. 3 armed men shot him as Anastasia lay in a chair with a warm towel over his face. You can read more about the reasons why Anastasia was killed in my other video about Carlo Gambino. There, I also describe all the versions of why Carlo became the boss after Albert's death. Armand Rava was not happy that Carlo Gambino had become the boss, but Dellacroce did not support his friend and swore an oath to Gambino. Carlo, realizing the situation, was the first to strike. In 1958, Armand Rava disappeared somewhere in Florida. There are different versions of who killed him, but the main one is that it was Gambino who ordered Salvatore Toto Aiello, a member of the Gambino family, to eliminate the enemy. Gambino then summoned Dellacroce to him, and after negotiations, they made a peace agreement. After the disappearance of Rava and the truce with Dellacroce, all the differences within the Gambino family were settled. From then on, Neil's power only grew. Dellacroce was even dubbed Captain of Captains. At the same time, he also acquired the nickname O'Neill, because he once disguised himself as a Catholic priest and introduced himself as Reverend Timothy O'Neill to infiltrate a place where his victim was. Dellacroce was also called the Pole because of his non-Italian appearance, though no one dared to call him that to his face. During those years, authorities began to crack down on the Mafia, including the Gambino family. One way to nail the mobsters was through charges of tax evasion. To ward off IRS suspicion, Dellacroce registered as an employee of the Royal Crown Bottling Company in Newark, New Jersey. The company's president, Martin Goldman, was Dellacroce's buddy and worked closely with him. Goldman helped Dellacroce and several other gangsters get fictitious jobs but soon came to the attention of law enforcement. He was arrested and tried for extortion and laundering money for the mob. Dellacroce was summoned to court, where he invoked the Fifth Amendment 18 times. Despite his legal problems, Neil's career in the Mafia continued to thrive. In 1965, Dellacroce's ascendancy began. Carlo Gambino ousted the aging Joseph Biondo as underboss and put Neil Dellacroce in his place. Soon after, journalists dubbed him the second most powerful mobster in the United States, after Carlo Gambino. Dellacroce also took over the Brooklyn docks after Anastasia's death, ousting Albert's brother, Tony Anastasia. Neil was a key figure in the truck driver unions and, as mentioned earlier, a pivotal figure in the American Mafia. This is confirmed by the following story. On September 22, 1966, Queens hosted a historic meeting of the Mafia's top brass at La Stella restaurant. Dellacroce was there with 12 other high-ranking East Coast members, including Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, Santo Trafficante of Tampa, and Carlos Marcello of New Orleans. Thanks to ubiquitous informants, authorities learned of the meeting and arrived at the restaurant. All 13 participants were arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy. The meeting became known in the press as the Little Appalachian, similar to another meeting in Appalachian in 1957, which was attended by more than 60 high-ranking mobsters and was also interrupted by police. The purpose of the meeting at La Stella restaurant remained a mystery to authorities. According to one version, it was to decide who would succeed the terminally ill head of the Lucchese family, Tommy Lucchese. Whatever the reason, the event was extremely important to the world of organized crime. Dellacroce and others at the trial refused to testify before the grand jury. No serious charges were brought against them at the time, but later the court would penalize recalcitrant mobsters for refusing to testify. For example, in September 1971, subpoenaed again, Dellacroce refused to testify before a Manhattan grand jury in the case of a mob takeover of a casino in the Dominican Republic. He was sentenced to a year in prison. After this term, he returned to the Ravenite to continue managing the business. On August 1, 1972, an armed gangster named Carlo Lombardi broke into the club and fired 4 shots at Dellacroce's bodyguard, brother Carmine Consalvo. Lombardi was disarmed and beaten but managed to escape. The following week, he broke into the club again, this time with an assault rifle, and tried to kill Dellacroce, but the rifle jammed, and he escaped again. The following week, Dellacroce's men tracked down Lombardi and shot him in his own car. 2 months later, an associate of Lombardi's, Joseph Fillo, was shot and killed. However, this case was the exception rather than the rule. In general, Neil enjoyed absolute and unquestioned authority in his circles, and no one wanted to kill him or dared to because of his steely character. He even received the nickname Man's Man. He held all of Manhattan in his power, and his orders were obeyed by everyone. Therefore, it is not surprising that when Carlo Gambino's health deteriorated in the early 1970s, it was Dellacroce, as underboss, who took charge of all the family's daily operations, and all other members were obliged to obey him. Aniello Neil Dellacroce was not only popular among the mafiosi but also among the Italian residents of Mulberry Street. Born there, he was a sort of godfather to the neighborhood, always ready to help Italians in need. His doors were always open to those seeking assistance. In return, residents kept an eye on the neighborhood and reported any strange people, unexpected tenants, or new cars in the parking lots. This security system, where all parties looked out for each other, operated for several decades and greatly hindered the work of the FBI and police. However, even this local protection didn't save Dellacroce in 1972 when he was indicted for tax evasion for failing to report stock worth more than $100,000 to Yankee Plastics, from whom he was also extorting money. Despite his attempts to evade responsibility, Dellacroce was sentenced in June 1973 to 5 years in Atlanta Federal Prison. Thanks to his connections, he enjoyed a special position in prison, complete with a personal chef, and continued to run his operations from behind bars. After serving 3 out of 5 years in Atlanta, Dellacroce went to Rikers Island for a 6-month sentence for contempt of jury duty, closer to his native New York. Despite his prison time, Dellacroce's business flourished. In 1974, the Gambino family's business was at its peak, generating huge profits through a well-oiled system of illegal operations ranging from labor unions to bookmaking to usury. Under Neil Dellacroce's leadership, even from behind bars, the Gambino family became one of the most powerful mafia families in the country, with dozens of captains and hundreds of soldiers. One of these captains was loan shark Antonio Plate, known as Tony Plate, who first worked in the Bronx, then moved to Miami and put Charlie Calise in his place, receiving a monthly cut from him. Plate had a disagreement with Calise and suspected him of passing information to the FBI. After conferring with Dellacroce, Plate obtained permission to kill Calise. On July 7, 1974, Calise's body was found with 5 bullet holes, 2 in his eyes, 2 in his ears, and 1 in his mouth, sending a clear message to those who saw too much and talked too much. Sources later confirmed that Charlie Calise was indeed an FBI informant. Meanwhile, Dellacroce was eagerly awaiting his release so he could start giving orders in person instead of from a jail cell. As he awaited his release, the dying Carlo Gambino appointed his successor. Most expected it would be Neil Dellacroce, but to everyone's surprise, it was Paul Castellano. The decision to appoint Castellano as boss of the Gambino family left many members unhappy, as Castellano was more of a businessman than a mobster. Dellacroce accepted the decision without controversy, remaining underboss, while Joseph Joe N. Gallo was appointed as consigliere of the family. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died in his bed, and the reins officially passed to Paul Castellano. Dellacroce, by this point, had been released from Rikers Island for health reasons, needing surgery to remove his gallbladder. After the surgery, he returned to duty at the Ravenite as underboss. Castellano unconditionally recognized Dellacroce's merit and authority, but the family was still divided into 2 factions, those loyal to Castellano and those loyal to Dellacroce. During this period, authorities attempted once again to imprison Neil Dellacroce. In 1979, after nearly 5 years of thorough investigation, police arrested Dellacroce and Tony Plate on charges of conspiring to kill Charlie Calise. The basis for this was the testimony of mobster James "Jimmy the Weasel" Frasciano, an FBI informant, who claimed that in 1974 he visited Plate to talk business, and Plate told him about the murder. Dellacroce feared that Plate would turn him in, as Plate was the only one linking him to Frasciano. In May 1979, Tony Plate went out with an acquaintance and did not return. Neither he, his friend, nor the car in which they left was ever found. Predictably, the case against Dellacroce collapsed, and he was acquitted of all charges. At the same time, discontent was growing within the Gambino family. More and more members were unhappy with Castellano's reign, feeling he was too greedy and arrogant toward the guys on the street who did all the work. Meanwhile, New York detectives began to focus on Neil Dellacroce, who by this time had been brought to trial 15 times but almost always emerged victorious. In his 50 years of criminal activity, he had spent only 6 years in prison. The operation, named Acorn, faced constant delays for various reasons. The FBI tried to rent an apartment near the Ravenite Social Club for surveillance, but vigilant Italian residents of Mulberry Street repeatedly refused them. The solution came in the form of an apartment directly across the street from the club, rented by a Chinese man. Surveillance was set up, but another obstacle arose: Neil's sheepdog, Duke, who prevented the installation of listening devices. The agents fed Duke tranquilizer-laced wieners and installed the wiretaps, but Ravenite security guards almost immediately discovered them. On another occasion, the guards realized detectives were hiding in the trunks of cars parked near the club's entrance. Dellacroce ordered the cars to be sprayed with fire hydrants, forcing the cops out. In 1981, the FBI finally succeeded. Agents managed to tap the phone of Angelo Ruggiero, who thought his phone line was safe because the house was in his daughter's name. Ruggiero was mistaken. For several years, agents avidly listened to details from Gambino family members about loan sharking and drug dealing. By 1983, Ruggiero had said enough to warrant his arrest. John Gotti's brother, Gene, also went on trial. Additionally, tapes of conversations from Ruggiero's house allowed the FBI to obtain permission to install a wiretap in Paul Castellano's house. By this time, Dellacroce was already suffering from cancer and was very weakened, but he remained involved in day-to-day operations. By 1984, a significant evidentiary base had been gathered against the 5 New York Mafia families. That November, Dellacroce was indicted for income tax evasion, and in February 1985, Neil, Paul Castellano, and other family members were accused of racketeering, which became part of the Mafia Commission trial. In March, Dellacroce, his son, Angelo Ruggiero, and 7 other Gambino family members were charged with racketeering. None of them pleaded guilty. Paul Castellano faced 78 counts in June 1985. Ruggiero managed to get his hands on the FBI wiretap tapes, and Castellano demanded they be given to him. However, those tapes revealed John Gotti, Ruggiero, and others discussing their drug trade dealings and badmouthing the boss. If Castellano had heard them, it would have meant a death sentence. Dellacroce acted as a mediator, trying to protect his men by delaying the handoff as much as possible. He told Castellano the tapes contained very private conversations and that Ruggiero was embarrassed to hand them over. Gotti later suggested to Dellacroce that they kill Castellano, but Neil rejected the idea. On a tapped phone call, he told Gotti, "You don't understand La Cosa Nostra. La Cosa Nostra means that the boss is your boss." By December 1985, Dellacroce faced more charges, including drug trafficking and criminal conspiracy. That same month, his son pleaded guilty, collectively facing about 20 years in prison. Armando managed to escape before the verdict was announced. Neil, weakened by cancer, died on December 2, at Immaculate Virgin Mary Hospital in Queens, in a room registered under the name Timothy O'Neill, at the age of 71. Paul Castellano, out on bail, didn't attend Dellacroce's funeral. Without Dellacroce's wise counsel, John Gotti and Sammy Gravano organized a successful assassination attempt on Castellano. On December 16, 1985, their hitmen shot Castellano and his assistant outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. 2 weeks later, Gotti became the head of the Gambino family. Neil Dellacroce's figure is not as well known as some others, yet he embodied all the outstanding features of an old-school mobster. Thank you for joining us on exploring the true events of the life of Neil Dellacroce. If you found this exploration of Mafia history intriguing, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Inside the Secret World of Mafia Titans. Stay tuned for more compelling stories from the shadowy underworld of organized crime.